Get your body ready. We're going to talk about movement. Woo! So one of the brain's most basic functions is getting us to move. Even simple single-celled organisms have little flagellum that allow them to move towards things that they want to eat. If you look at a spider, right, small, very simple creature, it can move, it can run away from danger, it can move towards food. Movement is the core of what makes us living creatures. Unless you're a plant. Plants generally not known for movement. That's one of the things that makes plants plants. So next time you see a piece of broccoli, feel superior to it. So we can't talk about movement without talking about muscles. The contraction of muscles is responsible for movement. We have our smooth muscles, which control the digestive system and other organs. We have our skeletal muscles, our striated muscles, which control our movement and are connected to bones via ligaments and all those fun things. Uh, ligaments, they're just fun. That's what everybody knows ligaments to be. They're like, oh man, you know what would make this party fun? Ligaments. And then we have our cardiac muscles, which are the muscles of our heart, which, if you did not know this, your heart, very important in general. And they have the properties of skeletal and smooth muscles. So here we have several different types of muscles. So we have our smooth muscles over here, A, and those are found in the intestines and other organs, and those consist of long, thin cells. Then we have our skeletal or striated muscles, and those consist of long cylindrical fibers with stripes. And then we have our cardiac muscles, and if you can look, it looks like if these two had like a baby, these cardiac muscles are kind of a mix between the two. So muscles are composed of a bunch of fibers. Now, a muscle fiber might just receive or only receives input from one axon, but a single axon could stimulate multiple muscle fibers. Acetylcholine is what is responsible for the muscle contraction. We've talked about acetylcholine a little bit before, but remember that acetylcholine is very important when we're dealing with muscle contraction. So here we can see one axon, right? And it stimulates very specific muscle fibers. Boop, 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 and a boop. Your muscles work in antagonistic groups. So when one contracts, the other is relaxing. So acetylcholine is related to the excitation of skeletal muscles to make them contract. So you have your flexor muscles, which are going to be flexing to raise an appendage, and then you have your extensor muscles that are going to be extending an appendage or straightening it. So let's say that you had your arm, face like just reaching out to something. If you took your hand and pointed it to the sky, right, that is bringing it in. So that's your flexor muscle. Then if you extend it out to reach somebody, reach like I don't know, a thing, a pen. I don't know what people reach out for. I was going to say reach out for somebody's hand, but we don't do that anymore. Social distancing. So the reaching out would be the extensor muscle. So your biceps and triceps are antagonistic. When your bicep is contracting, your tricep is relaxing. When your bicep is relaxing, your tricep is contracting. So there are two different types of skeletal muscles. They range from fast twitch muscles that produce fast contractions but fatigue rapidly. And you have slow twitch, which produce less vigorous contractions but are much slower to fatigue. So different people are going to have different percentages of fast twitch to slow twitch muscles. So our slow twitch fibers are aerobic, so they require oxygen during movement, and because of that, they don't fatigue. So when you're doing non-strenuous activities, so for example, I'm sitting and I'm adjusting in my chair, those are slow twitch muscles. I'm not going to get tired from sitting, although sometimes I will get tired from sitting, but also I'm just a little bit stir crazy. There are also our fast twitch fibers, which are anaerobic and use reactions that do not require oxygen, meaning they're more likely to be fatigued. So if you were, doing martial arts and you were, blocking a whole bunch of kicks and punches that were coming at you. Those require quick movements, and so after a while, your arms are going to get sore because you're utilizing your fast twitch fibers. So temperature is related to our ability to move. So here's a little fish right here about to be attacked by, or in the middle of being attacked by this pelican. Fish are cold-blooded. Pelicans, birds, are warm-blooded. So the fish's contractions are going to be slower due to the fact that its muscles are colder, which means that in order to get the same movement, it's going to need to engage more muscles. So, in addition to your five senses smell, sight, hearing, all that fun stuff we have a sense called proprioception. And it's a sense of where your body is in space or movement of your body. So, we have muscle spindles that are proprioceptors, they respond to the stretch of a muscle. So, what these are useful for is the coordination of muscle movement. So, if my bicep is stretching, right, then my the proprioceptors will send a signal to my brain, and then it'll send a signal to my tricep to work in the opposite direction. So this prevents our muscles from tearing at each other, because if both try to stretch at the same time, I'm going to tear a muscle. But if one's contracting while the other is relaxing, then everything will be great. So our muscle movement is actually very complicated because they need to properly signal to each other that one is moving so that the other can move without issue. The Golgi tendon organ is another type of proprioceptor, and it responds to increases in muscle tension. So if you're lifting a weight, depending on how heavy the weight is, more tension is going to be applied. These are located in the tendons, and they help you know how much compensation your other muscles need to do. Proper compensation ensures that you don't injure your muscles. If you've ever tried to lift something that was lighter or heavier than you were expecting, you probably felt that overstrain or that strain from like not putting enough into it, and that's because your brain didn't communicate properly to your muscles to compensate. So the Golgi tendon organ and all of our proprioceptors help us properly coordinate muscle movement. So here we can see the muscle spindles and the Golgi tendon organ. So let's say I was holding a weight in my hand. That's a very well drawn weight, right? I'm holding it with my little hand. the tension and the contraction are being registered by these proprioceptors, and they're sending that information to the brain and telling the other muscles to compensate properly for it. Now, if you've seen this classic reflex where you take a little hammer and then you hit the knee, what's happening is you're stretching the patellar tendon, which is right in this area. By doing so, you're triggering that compensatory action from the muscles in the back of the leg. So, by applying pressure to a tendon, that Golgi reflex tendon or Golgi tendon reflex is going to activate. So reflexes are involuntary, consistent, and automatic responses to stimuli. We don't have to think about them, right? If somebody blows into your face and some of the air hits your eyes, you have an automatic blink response, right? That is automatic, and if you do blink when somebody like makes a quick motion towards you, you're not dumb for doing that. And the people who made fun of me for saying that I winced or whatever, well, it's a reflex, so you can't control it. Anyway, a lot of our movements are a combination of voluntary movements and involuntary movements. So there are the things that we control and the things that we don't. And some movements are going to change based off of the feedback that we get. There are certain things that, if you've ever done the thing where you start walking and then you realize mid-step that you forgot something in the house or you're going in the wrong direction, it's very hard to stop mid-step, right? So that type of behavior, that type of movement can't be stopped while initiated. Other things are based off of feedback, right? So let's say you're writing your name with a pen, and as you're writing, you notice that on the H in your name, the pen starts to dry up, right? You don't continue writing your entire name. You're responding to an immediate stimulus, and then you change your behavior as a result. So a lot of our behavior consists of rapid sequences of individual movements. So, for example, walking, we think that it's just our legs moving like little twigs back and forth, but muscles are tensing in our thighs, in our calves, in our feet. We're balancing our core and tightening and loosening as necessary. We're coordinating our hands and our arms as they swing to counterbalance our shifts in weight. So a lot of our movements aren't as simple as we might originally assume. And then we also have what are called central pattern generators. And there are just certain mechanisms in the spinal cord or other parts of us that allow us to generate very specific repetitive movements. So some of the examples given are the flapping of wings in birds, when dogs do their wet dog shake, right? But even like something like clapping, once we get into like the vibe of it, it's pretty automatic, right? So there are certain behaviors that are kind of inbuilt and their sequence is fixed from beginning to end. These are referred to as motor programs. So if you've ever seen an animal grooming itself, it has a specific way that it does it. Or if you think about yawning, right? There's a specific way that we do it, and it's fixed from beginning to end. Now, it's automatic, but thinking about it or trying to or being you can be distracted by it, and that can interfere with the action. There is a difference between trying to yawn, right, versus it actually happening naturally. So, the more we learn about how the brain and spine coordinate to create movement, the more hope it gives us for understanding how to help people who've experienced damage to the spinal cord or who have had limb amputations. Because if we can find ways to mimic those impulses or mimic the ability to receive those impulses, then we can create artificial limbs that actually respond to impulses from the brain and spine. So back to the brain, that's my very good brain, right, facing this way. Over here, we have the precentral gyrus located in the frontal lobe, and that connects to the brainstem and then the spinal cord. Man, great drawings everywhere. And those control our muscles and motor movements. So we're really looking at this area right here. Now, basal ganglia, as you might remember, we're dealing with a lot of dopamine there. Dopamine is related to movement. We have the reticular formation. We have these tracts going out of the brainstem, and all these parts of the brain are responsible for different aspects of movement, getting input from the spine and processing that information, and then sending it back out to control the muscles and tell them what to do next. So, just to refresh, we have our posterior parietal cortex, we have our primary somatosensory cortex, we have our central sulcus, the primary motor cortex, the supplementary motor cortex, our premotor cortex, because it's right before the motor cortex, and then we have our prefrontal cortex, because it is at the front of the frontal cortex. So, when you're looking at our primary motor cortex, if you'll remember, there's a little homunculus. This is me drawing a homunculus, and there's the hand right there. And different parts of the motor cortex are responsible for specific areas of the opposite side of the body. Because our brain, we have our left side and our right side, and the left controls the right, and the right controls and gets input from the left. So there is some overlap. Obviously, nothing's ever perfect or set in stone, but in general, we have specific areas for specific parts of the body. Our primary motor cortex is active when we intend to move. So the primary motor cortex says, do this thing. So just now, as I said, do this thing, I very intentionally pointed forward and punctuated every movement. That's my primary motor cortex telling my finger to point every time. Also, when people do that thing when they clap to enunciate or like make a point seem more poignant, that's the primary motor cortex controlling that intentional movement. So once again, here is the homunculus of the brain. So remember, we have our motor cortices and our somatosensory cortices, and different parts of the brain are going to, or sorry, different parts of our body are going to take up more of our brain, because things like the hands, right? We need to get a lot of very specific information from our hands. Our neck, right? Even though it's just as big as our hands, we don't really need to know what's going on there. We need to know if something is on there, if like somebody's choking us, we would want to know that that's happening, but we don't really need to know the details of it. We don't need to be precise with that. So These are the homunculi of the brain, and they just show how much different things take up of our brain. So behind our frontal lobe is the parietal lobe, and in the back we have the posterior parietal cortex, right? So that helps us with proprioception. It helps us know where our body is. It keeps track of where we've put things, right? Damage to this area of the brain makes it much harder for us to coordinate visual stimuli with movement. So if I am trying to catch a ball, I don't need to look at where my hand currently is to catch the ball because I should have an idea of where my hand is if my posterior parietal cortex is working properly. So any issues with the PPC, as I'll call it, because I don't want to keep on saying posterior parietal cortex, any issues with the PPC are going to affect our ability to properly plan and coordinate movement. So our premotor cortex helps us prepare for movement. It receives information about the environment and helps integrate all the information about our position and posture and helps us organize the general direction that we want to move. Our supplementary motor cortex helps us organize really quick sequences of movement, and it's activated right before we actually do the thing. And because it's responding to information from the environment, if we make an error in some way, we can correct the movement. So we can inhibit the current movement and correct the movement. Then we have our prefrontal cortex, which stores our sensory information relative to a movement, and it's helps you do the planning in order to figure out what could happen if you were to do a specific thing, and it's active during right before the movement. So your eye, I'm not sure if you knew this about your eye, but your eyes don't stay still all the time. That's not that's how eyes look. They always have little weird squigglies in them, but they are constantly moving around and making these little movements called saccades, and that is an involuntary movement. It's almost fully automatic. You don't consciously move your eyes around all the time. It's automatic. Now, we can inhibit that movement. So you can do what's called an anti-saccade task, which would just be keeping your eyes fully steady. But it actually requires a lot of coordination in parts of the brain, such as the prefrontal cortex and the basal ganglia. So the ability to do this matures through adolescence, which makes sense because one, we know that the prefrontal cortex develops the older that you get, and the ability to just in general coordinate muscle movements changes as you get older. That's why younger children tend to be very terrible at keeping their balance, right? They're not great. There are also these fun neurons called mirror neurons. So the way these were discovered was we hooked up a monkey to I can't remember if it was I believe it was an EEG, and they monitored what was happening in the monkey's brain while the monkey was watching another monkey do a specific task, and the same pathways would light up when that monkey was doing the task also lit up and were active while the monkey was watching another monkey do the task, which means that there are neurons that are active when we're doing a thing and also when we are watching somebody else do a thing. Now, mirror neurons are still not fully understood. but some people say that they can explain our ability to have empathy, right? Why do we enjoy seeing other people do things? When we are watching a sports game or a movie, right, we feel like we're in the action, even though we're not being like, shot at by spies or scoring the winning touchdown. Those victories, those threats seem just as intense as if we were actually in that situation. So, one theory is that mirror neurons are responsible for our ability to put ourselves in the shoes of other people. So the fact that babies, when they see us making faces, will try to mimic those faces shows that mirror neurons might play a distinct role in social interaction. So messages from the brain have to reach the spine. You know that, but there are two tracks that go from the cerebral cortices to the spinal cord. We have the lateral cortical spinal tract and the medial cortical spinal tract. Do you remember what lateral is and what medial is? You thought that we wouldn't have to remember them, and I told you that they'd be important. So if you're dealing with the body, right, this is my body. I should go on a diet. Things that are closer to the center are medial. Things that are farther away are lateral. Now you know. So our lateral cortical spinal tract, you're going to see movement being coordinated in the hands and feet. We're also seeing coordination with the red nucleus, which helps coordinate the arm muscles. And our medial cortical spinal tract is made up of axons coming from the reticular formation, the midbrain tectum, and the vestibular nucleus. And it's controlling the muscles of the neck, our shoulders, and our trunk. So our body. So this is helpful for things that require both sides of the body operating in tandem. So things like walking, turning, bending down, standing up, sitting down. So our lateral tract, this is our entire brain divided up. And so you see it starts on one side, but it crosses to the opposite side of the spine because the right side controls the left side and vice versa, right? So those are the lateral tracks. Now, the medial tracks stay relatively center because they're more focused on things regarding both sides, right? The lateral, is helpful if I need to pick something up with my hand because it's going to cross over and control my hand. This is going to help me bend my abdomen so I can do crunches. By this, I mean this. I was pointing at it, forgot that you can't see my hands. The medial track would be useful if I'm bending over because I'm doing crunches, or if, oh, I dropped my pen. So my lateral is controlling my hand reaching out. My medial is controlling my entire body bending down. So I'm reaching towards my pen. So I'm getting information from the cerebral cortex, which goes all the way down, routes, splits to the other side, goes to the spinal cord, and tells my muscles to reach for the pen. Now I'm reaching blindly, and then my hand feels something metallic. And so that metallic feel gets sent, switches to the opposite side of my brain. And now I'm like, my pen's right there, and then I send the muscle down, the information of the muscle down to grab and contract, right? And then once I have it, it goes back up. And then now I'm pulling the pen back down, and then it goes back up, right? So these are touch paths, the constant feedback, the sending, the receiving of information that allows us to move. So it's not biopsychology if we don't talk about all the things that can go wrong. So we have paralysis, obviously, that is the inability to control certain parts of the body. We have paraplegia or quadriplegia, which is a loss of sensation and muscle control in either just the legs or both the arms and the legs. You have hemiplegia, which is only the loss of sensation and muscle movement on one side, the left or right. We have paralysis. We have tabes dorsalis, which is when you have impaired sensations and muscle control of the legs and pelvic region, and that affects your ability to control your bowels and bladder. We also have ALS, which, if you remember the water bucket challenge, that's what that was for. And it is a debilitating disease where you get gradual weakness and paralysis starting in the arms and spreading to the legs. So when the spinal cord isn't doing its job, obviously it's going to have a serious effect on our ability to coordinate our muscles. Now, the where the damage occurs in the spinal cord is going to affect what symptoms we see. So you might remember our old friend, the cerebellum, hanging out in the back of our little brain. I'm getting worse and worse at drawing brains, I swear. And the cerebellum is associated with balance and coordination. There are more neurons in the cerebellum than in all other brain areas combined. Fun little fact. So, damage to the cerebellum not only causes trouble with balance and coordination, but it can cause trouble with movements requiring precise aim and timing. So if you were trying to clap your hands, especially to a rhythm, if you're or speaking, we don't think about speaking often as coordinating muscle movements, but a lot of muscles are involved in your ability to shape your mouth properly in order to make sure that the words come out correctly, right? Writing and other tasks. The cerebellum also helps us create new motor programs that allow for us to do specific sequences of actions that require timing. Also, when we're dealing with attending to specific things like visual stimuli, our cerebellum helps us shift between one thing and another. The cerebellum is also responsible for responding to sensory information, even if there's no movement present. Also, one cool thing that it's responsible for is violations of sensory information. So, if I go to grab a piece of ice and it is hot, my cerebellum goes, ha, "This is there's something wrong with this. This is not what's supposed to be there, right?" And again, it's responsible for certain aspects of attention. Our cerebellum receives input from the spinal cord, our sensory systems, and the cerebral cortex and sends it to the cerebellar cortex. What is the cerebellar cortex, you might ask? It is the surface of the cerebellum. So we have these cerebellar cortex neurons, and they're arranged in this crisscross pattern. So we have our Purkinje cells that look like this, and then we have our parallel fibers, which are just parallel to each other but perpendicular to the Purkinje cells. The excitation of Purkinje cells is going to create a longer response. So the parallel fibers excite the Purkinje cells. The Purkinje cells transmit inhibitory messages to the nuclei of the cerebellum, and also the vestibular nuclei in the brainstem, and then messages are later sent to the midbrain and the thalamus. So here we go. We have these parallel fibers, right? And then we have our Purkinje cells, these little branches. So the parallel fibers, when they get excited, they send messages to the Purkinje cells. Those get excited, and then everything follows from there. Do you remember our good friend the basal ganglia? It is one of these subcortical structures that is responsible for initiating action, not guided by a specific stimulus. So it is composed of the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus, I almost Spanish pronounced that, pallidus, not paidas, right? It's not a paidas sounds like a delicious dessert. Can I get the Paidas with a side of I don't know, Politis, sorry. But also if somebody just wants to create a dessert called Paidas, please do. So we've got our basal ganglia hanging out here. We have the caudate nucleus. We have our thalamus hanging out, just hiding. We have our subthalamic nucleus because it's below the thalamus. We have our substantia nigra, where a lot of our dopamine is hanging out. We have the putamen, and then we have our delicious global pedius. No, I'm just kidding. The global pallidus. So our caudate nucleus and putamen receive input from the cortex and send output to the pedius. The global pedius connects to the thalamus, which relays information to the motor areas in the prefrontal cortex, and the basal ganglia select a movement to make by ceasing to inhibit it. So it stops inhibition, allowing movement to happen. So we have two pathways that information can travel. We have the direct pathway and we have the indirect pathway. The indirect pathway has more connections to the global pallidus. I still want to say, I just want to call it the global empanada. Guys, I might just be very hungry right now, and I think that's the issue. Don't record a lecture while you're hungry because everything starts to look like food. These look like little tacos. This looks like a cabeza, right? Oh, because that's what it is. So the maybe if I'm lucky, I can get just like a little bit of lengua, right? Okay, sorry, very hungry. The for the next slide, I promise I'll go like warm up some pizza or something before I start recording. So the in the indirect pathway, we have more connections with the global pallidus. Had to slow it down so I didn't say food. Also, just real quick, the amygdala looks like a ramen noodle. Very hungry. So, brain areas and motor learning. The learning of any new skill requires multiple areas of the brain involved in the control of movement. The basal ganglia are critical for learning new motor skills in order to organize the sequences of movement in order to, and also in order to create automatic behaviors and habits. So think of driving a car. The first time you drove a car or rode a bike, there were lots of things that you had to keep in mind all the time. Now that you've been doing it for a while, it's almost automatic. That's because of the basal ganglia. It learns how to do the behavior so you don't have to voluntarily control things. It allows you to do a lot of the behavior automatically. So, this idea that practice makes perfect makes sense because if you reinforce certain neuronal pathways, right? And this gets reinforced over and over, then it becomes much easier to activate it. Things that aren't important and aren't helpful, those don't last, but the ones that are super helpful get reinforced until they are basically automatic. And the pathways, the sequence of connections that you need in order to make a specific action happen, are reinforced over time. So when we're looking at movement, for us, it often feels like the decision to move and the movement itself occur simultaneously. I think about, oh, I need the remote for my television, and as I'm thinking about it, I'm moving towards it. But there's a 200 millisecond delay between the thought and the movement. So we become conscious of the decision to move after the process has already begun. So the even though from our perspective it seems like it's a very seamless process, it unfortunately, the biological truth of it is that there is a delay. Sit down if you're not sitting down yet. This one's a little bit of a mind flipperoonie. So there was a circle, right? And it's moving. This little dot is moving around the circle. So it's making a circle within the circle. Now, you would be taken into a room for this experiment, and you would be told to press a button when you want the circle to stop. So maybe you want it to stop here, maybe you want it to stop here, maybe you want it to stop here, but you need to keep track of two things, right? When you actually want it to stop, and then keep track of when you've made the decision to stop. So the so for example, I might say I want it to stop at 30 seconds, and I made the decision to stop at 25 seconds. So right when it hits 25, I go, you know what? I want it to stop in 5 seconds. So I plan on hitting the button here. Now, I report that I want it to stop at 30, and that I decided that I wanted it to stop at 30 at 25. This is when I made the decision. And you would think that my brain activity would say that at 25 seconds, I made the decision. But actually, my brain activity shows that this is where the light actually was at 20 seconds when I made the decision, when my body actually got ready to stop the light. So at 20 seconds, my body was already ready to stop the light at 30 seconds, but at 25 seconds, I had the conscious decision to stop the light. So my body was ready to do the action before I consciously decided that I wanted to do the action. Once again, so I wanted it to stop at 30. I decided that I wanted to stop at 30 at 25. But according to the brain scan, I actually started preparing to do the action before I was consciously aware that I wanted to do the action. So our brains are actually preparing before we're even aware that we're preparing for something. Oh, whew. I still haven't eaten. So, brain disorders such as Parkinson's and Huntington's disease not only affect movement, but also they affect our mood, our memory, and cognition because of the complex interactions between parts of the brain. You injure one part, and it's not just going to impair one specific thing. The things are moving through multiple parts of the brain. So, if you're not familiar with Parkinson's, it is a movement disorder characterized by muscle tremors, rigidity of the arms and extremities, slow movements, and difficulty initiating physical and mental activity. So trying to be spontaneous, right? If somebody if kids are playing ball and the ball comes flying towards you, trying to initiate the activity to like stop the ball or catch it is going to be very difficult. Other symptoms might include depression, issues with memory and reasoning, loss of olfaction, your sense of smell, and other cognitive deficiency. So, one of the causes of Parkinson's is the gradual and progressive death of neurons, specifically in the substantia nigra. You might have heard me say this before, but the substantia nigra is responsible for a lot of the dopamine related parts of our brain. So, the substantia nigra sends dopamine releasing axons to our brain, and dopamine is responsible for movement. So, loss of dopamine leads to less stimulation of the motor cortices and makes it much harder for us to initiate movements. So usually you would see information flowing, right, very easily. But because of the decreased inhibition from the putamen to the global pallidus and to the thalamus, you're getting less excitation to the motor cortices, which means that you're going to get less muscle movement. So when it comes to the causes of Parkinson's, studies suggest that there's a genetic component to the early onset of Parkinson's, but it's only a small factor when it comes to late onset Parkinson's. Environmental influences such as exposure to toxins, herbicides, fungicides, things like that in the environment, or traumatic head injury can be associated with later development of Parkinson's. So cigarette smoking as well. So if you're smoking cigarettes right now, quit it. And also, oh no, coffee drinking. Oh, they're related to a decreased chance of developing Parkinson's disease. Keep on smoking. Keep on drinking that coffee. Woo! That feels good. That feels honestly that feels great, and that is because of the stimulant properties. Because stimulation of the brain is going to prevent issues that are related to under stimulation of the brain. So obviously, don't just smoke a pack a day and drink 7 cups of coffee a day to stop Parkinson's, but sometimes things that are generally bad for us can have some positive qualities. So another thing to be aware of is that the damaged mitochondria of the cells, so those little bacteria that are stuck in the cells, poor little guys, seem to be common to most of the factors that increase the risk of Parkinson's disease. So obviously, if we're doing things that damage our cells and their structures, then we're going to see that the function of those cells degrades over time. One of the treatments for Parkinson's is the drug L-DOPA. The reason is because the brain can break down L-DOPA and use it to create more dopamine. If you are in a later stage of the disease, it's not effective and it doesn't prevent the continued loss of neurons. And because we can't put it in the correct place, it can enter other brain cells, producing unpleasant side effects. So, some other possible treatments are drugs that directly stimulate the dopamine receptors. So, those would be dopamine agonists. We also have the ability to implant electrodes to stimulate areas in the brain. There are also more experimental strategies, such as taking stem cells from fetuses and transplanting that brain tissue into the brain in order to differentiate into the needed cells, or implantation of stem cells that are programmed to produce large quantities of L-DOPA. So Huntington's disease has a very strong genetic component. It affects 1 in every 10,000 people in the United States, and onset usually occurs between the ages of 30 and 50. It is characterized by a variety of motor symptoms. It is associated with gradual and extensive brain damage, especially in the basal ganglia, but also in parts of the cerebral cortex. Initial motor symptoms could be arm jerks and facial twitches, but the disease can very quickly degrade into tremors and things that affect the person's ability to walk and speak and control their voluntary movement. Side effects and related issues can be depression, memory impairment, alcoholism and drug use, anxiety, hallucination and delusions, and issues with judgment, and also sexual disorders and dysfunction. So we have healthy brain tissue here, and we have diseased brain tissue from Huntington's disease. So as you can see, the structures of the brain have degraded, right? There's a much larger area here. The discoloration shows you that, like, if you're, a cannibal and you're like, I'm going to eat me some brain, you want to eat this brain. This brain you take back to you send it back to the kitchen. You say, I'm sorry, this brain wasn't prepared well. So if you're having trouble remembering Huntington's disease, just think, what would a cannibal eat? I think that's the lesson to take away for this one. And just so you know, I'm not a cannibal. I just still haven't eaten yet, so everything looks like food to me. It's like a shiitake mushroom. So again, Huntington's disease has a very strong genetic component. So if your parents have it, you are almost guaranteed to have it. The autosomal dominant gene on chromosome number 4 is where we find it. And if you see the genetic combination CAG, the more of it that you see, the more certain that you'll see the disease develop later in life, and the earlier it's likely to develop. So again, the more CAG repeats that you have, as you can see, the earlier the onset. So somebody who, let's see, has 54 will develop Huntington's around 20. Somebody who has 40 will develop it probably around 50. If you have 86, then you'll start developing symptoms early in childhood. So when we're looking at disorders, when you see early onset, that means that it's very likely that there is a strong genetic influence, which is the case here with Huntington's disease. So the CAG repeats. We can see that it's the same for other types of dystrophies and other diseases. So again, our genes have a lot to do with how many things in our bodies develop and change over time. So CAG isn't just related to Huntington's, it can affect other things as well. And the more we see of that same gene, the more it's repeated, the more likely we're going to see the development of a specific phenotype. We did it. That's it. Sorry that it ended on a depressing note. Just take care of yourselves. That's all we can do. remember that our genes are one thing. They're one aspect of who we are and how we develop, but there is something that we can control. So if you're worried about whether or not you're going to get Parkinson's or Huntington's disease, one, if you don't have the genes for Huntington's disease, you're probably not going to get it. But for Parkinson's, we know that we can take care of ourselves. So, don't expose yourself to any harmful chemicals. Make sure that you're eating well. Smoke a cigarette and drink some coffee every so often. No doctor would ever consider that's not real medical advice. Please don't start smoking cigarettes just because of what I just said. But the great thing about studying this is we learn about these terrible things that can happen to us so we can make the necessary precautions to make sure that we live long and healthy lives. So take care of yourself.